Hey guys, tonight we're going to wander barefoot into the dim courtyards of Ming Dynasty China, where the poets wore layered robes, carried inkstones like sacred relics, and stared at the moon so long it probably filed a restraining order. The air is thick with sandalwood and ambition. The tea is always slightly too cold, and every brushstroke is part performance, part prayer. We're entering the quietest rebellion history ever produced, where men didn't raise swords but raised metaphors about plum blossoms. And yes, you probably won't survive this not from danger, but from sheer exquisite tedium. You'll hear tales of scrolls written by candlelight debates about crane posture and poetic crises sparked by one mildly disappointing cloud. This is not history's adrenaline chapter. This is the chapter with the whispering scholars, the 7-hour tea ceremonies, and the kind of heartbreak that rhymes on purpose. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it there? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge slowly through the gravel path of the scholar's courtyard past a mossy stone lantern, and a pond that reflects a nearly full moon with unsettling sincerity. You are in your 30s. You own precisely 12 robes, 6 brushes, 2 teapots, and one increasingly fragile sense of purpose. You have just finished grading the entrance essays of 16 students who all believe metaphors should hurt, and now finally you are free to do what every self-respecting scholar in the Ming era longs to do after dinner: wander into the night and write sad poems about the moon. The process begins as it always does with lighting a candle. Not just any candle. This one is beeswax hand-dipped, and annoyingly short for the hour you're hoping to spend wrestling syllables into obedience. You strike the flint with more melodrama than strictly necessary, and as the flame flickers to life, so too does the quiet performance of being a scholar who feels deeply. You adjust your robes, place the inkstone gently beside you on the stone bench, and look upward. The moon is doing its job, which is to say it is being breathtakingly indifferent to your presence. This is of course the entire point. The moon is not there to comfort you. It is there to challenge you, to reflect your insignificance with elegance, to mock you gently as you attempt to describe it using only 5 lines and a seasonal reference to chrysanthemums. The candlelight dances across your brush as you grind ink slowly in a clockwise circle, adding a few droplets of rainwater collected in a porcelain saucer earlier that afternoon. You believe because all proper poets do that. Rainwater from a storm that passed during dinner has more emotional depth than well water. Historians still argue whether this belief was based on science aesthetics or sheer exhaustion. You unroll your scroll with ceremony. You begin writing. The first line comes easily. Something about a pale sky and longing. A safe choice. You pause, look up again. The moon has shifted. Or maybe it hasn't. Maybe you blinked. You cross out the line. Begin again. Second attempt better. There's a verb now. Something moves. But the second character you choose implies restlessness when you meant restraint. You frown. This will not do. You look to the moon for help. It says nothing. Rude. Beside you, your teacup cools with indifference. You forgot to drink it earlier when you were busy composing a metaphor about silence. You sip it now, and it is predictably lukewarm. You make a note of this in your margin. Even the tea is half asleep. You consider turning that into a poem. Then reconsider. Too obvious. Too modern. Maybe better as a closing line, not an opening. Your fingers are smudged with ink. Your robes have creased along the sleeves where you leaned into the stone for inspiration. The candle sputters slightly. You feel the weight of expectation in the night air. A good poem is not just about beauty. It must also reflect the moral order of the cosmos. It must balance personal feeling with celestial indifference. You feel your spine straighten instinctively. There are ancestors to impress, teachers to appease. That one fellow scholar who always raises an eyebrow at your enjambment choices, he will definitely read this. You write a third draft of your opening. This one sticks. The moon looks on still unmoved, but perhaps a little amused. You lean back just enough to stretch your shoulders. Somewhere in the nearby bamboo grove, a cricket begins a solo. You allow it to finish its phrase before returning to your brush. Even the insects you think perform with better timing than your last attempt at meter. You write until your hand cramps slightly, until the lines begin to blur, not from tears because that would be far too gauche, but from a noble exhaustion, the kind born of trying to say something new about something ancient. Your poem is unfinished as many are. You roll the scroll loosely, not tightly tight. Rolls feel desperate. You place it beside your inkstone and blow out the candle. You do not reread your poem tonight. That would break the spell. Instead, you rise slowly, brush the dust from your sleeves, and bow once to the moon, not in reverence, but in mutual respect. And then you walk back across the courtyard, past the mossy lantern, past the sleeping pond, your poem tucked beneath your arm, like a secret you might decide to share tomorrow, or maybe not. The moon follows you all the way home. You wake late the next morning, though you pretend not to. Eyes still closed, you listen to the quiet stirrings of a courtyard already alive with faint broom swishes, low coughs, and the occasional clink of porcelain, never loud, never rushed, as though even the house knows that today is best approached like a bowl of delicate soup, carefully, reverently, and not before you're ready. You finally rise when the scent of jasmine tea becomes too persuasive to ignore. It's not bold, just persistent, like a polite scholar knocking on your thoughts. By the time you make your way to the garden pavilion, the sun is already slanting and sideways, catching on the corners of carved eaves and glinting off the lacquer of your ink table. This pavilion isn't just for writing, it's for pondering, which is like writing but slower and with more sighing. It was designed by a previous scholar who believed the ideal space for thinking required an exact blend of solitude, filtered light, and a view of something gently moving. He chose water, a narrow stream engineered to sound natural curls past the far edge of the stone floor, complete with a single arch bridge that exists only to be described in poems. You sit with your back straight, but not rigid, your inkstone still smudged with last night's effort. A fresh sheet of paper waits beside it. You won't use it yet. First comes the pause, the sacred meandering moment when you're neither writing nor preparing to write, but simply existing in the presence of thought. A scholar once described this phase as listening to the silence between your own thoughts. You suspect he meant it metaphorically. You, however, take it literally. Birdsong trickles in from the plum trees. You count 3 distinct patterns, one inquisitive, one scolding, and one that sounds like someone reciting multiplication tables while drunk. You sip your tea. It has cooled just enough to remind you that warmth is fleeting. You make a note of that in your mind, not for a poem, but for yourself. These are the small reflections you collect, not with urgency, but with a kind of gentle hoarding instinct. A breeze shifts the paper ever so slightly. You place your teacup on the edge to keep it from fluttering. The gesture feels poetic. Everything here wants to feel poetic, which is both charming and a little exhausting. Even the pavilion's beams are carved with subtle lines of verse. One reads, "A single word can cradle 10,000 shadows." You've never quite figured out what it means, but it does look beautiful in the morning light. This is the hour when other scholars might drop by. Not for conversation, but for company. There's an unspoken rule here: visiting the pondering pavilion means no greetings, no pleasantries. If someone joins you, they simply bow, settle into their spot, and begin to think. Maybe they write a line. Maybe they do nothing but watch a leaf spiral into the stream. No one explains. It is a ritual of shared silence. Today, no one arrives. Just as well. You reach for the brush, but don't dip it in ink. Not yet. You rest it between your fingers like a talisman. Last night's poem is still curled nearby. You haven't read it again. You don't need to. It's not about the words anymore. It's about the moment you caught them. That's what the moon does to you. It convinces you that meaning lives not in permanence, but in pause, in breath, in the ache of what almost made it to paper. You finally unroll the fresh sheet. You write the date in the top corner with absurd precision. Not because you're formal, but because you like the ritual, like stretching before a walk. Your first stroke of the day is always horizontal. Balance before depth, always. You begin with a line about ripples. Not metaphorical ones, actual ripples the way the stream catches light and distorts it. But halfway through the second character, you stop. Not because it's wrong, because it's too right. It feels planned, expected. You've learned that poetry, true poetry, doesn't come from correctness. It comes from surprise, from the word that shouldn't belong, but somehow does. You look up searching for the unexpected, and there it is. A dragonfly lands on the scroll, not near it on it. It stays there perfectly still, wings outstretched, as though reviewing your draft with cool disapproval. You stare at it. It stares back. It is the most beautiful interruption you've ever had. You do not shoo it. You wait. When it leaves, you do not try to capture it in a poem. That would be too easy, too grasping. You let it go, and in the space it leaves behind you, write your real first line. Not the one about ripples. The one about arrival and impermanence. The one that doesn't explain anything, but somehow makes everything feel understood. Historians still argue whether Ming Dynasty poets truly spent their mornings in quiet pavilions sipping tea and crafting metaphor beneath drifting petals, or whether this was a romantic illusion built by later scholars, nostalgic for a piece they never personally experienced. But the pavilions exist. The scrolls remain. The poems speak of mornings like this, slow, gentle, so carefully lived, they might as well be dreamed. You finish your line. You don't reread it. You just breathe. Then set down your brush and listen again. To the stream, to the birds, to the thoughts that haven't arrived yet but will when they're ready. And you wait. 'Cause this is the practice. Not the poem, but the patience. The afternoon deepens around you like steep tea, slow and golden, and you retreat into your study with the kind of movement reserved for those who believe transitions between spaces should be quiet enough to avoid waking old memories. The study itself smells of cedar and something fainter ink probably, or age. Its sliding paper doors admit just enough light to make the grain in the desk shimmer faintly, but not enough to distract. This is the hour of ritual, not inspiration. No grand verse will be composed now. No poetic epiphany will rise unbidden from the folds of your sleeve. This is the hour when a scholar prepares, not for glory, but for the mood that might allow it to visit. And so you begin, as you always do, with the inkstone. It is smooth, dense, and unchanging, a dependable object in a world that insists upon shifting. You hold it with both hands, not out of superstition, but reverence. Ink is not just pigment. It is the bridge between thought and silence. You set the inkstone on the table and unwrap your brush with a careful touch usually reserved for ceremonial scrolls or bruised fruit. The brush is thin-necked, goat-haired, and familiar to your fingers, in the way an old friend might be one who doesn't speak often, but always remembers how you take your tea. With your sleeves already bound at the elbows by narrow silk ties, you chose the faded indigo today. Out of instinct, more than intention, you pour a shallow spoon of rainwater into the well of the stone. It's not just any rainwater, it was collected the day before during a brief, almost embarrassed drizzle, the kind that arrives mid-afternoon and vanishes before anyone can acknowledge its presence. It was filtered through a bamboo gutter into a waiting earthenware bowl, and left overnight beneath a covering of folded mulberry paper, inked with a short, unfinished verse about nothing in particular. The water smells faintly of wind. You believe this makes the ink more introspective. Grinding the ink takes time. You move in slow, patient circles, listening to the faint whisper of stone on stone. The pigment, which starts as a dry black brick, slowly softens into a silky pool. You do not speak. No one is present to hear you anyway, except perhaps the poem forming in some future part of your mind, still unnamed and unready. You press your brush into the ink lift. It tests it on the edge of scrap paper. The mark it leaves is too pale. You grind a bit more. Test again. Better, but still shy. You add a single droplet more. This, you believe, is the most important part of the day. Not the moment of writing, but the precise second the ink turns from pigment into potential. It's a sacred sort of ambiguity. And today, like most days, it resists you. The light shifts. You adjust the paper doors by a finger's width to let in a stronger glow. A breeze follows, accompanied by a chorus of late summer cicadas. You close your eyes and listen. It's said that cicadas sing most loudly when they know they have only days left. Whether or not this is true doesn't matter. It's poetically true, and that's enough. A scholar once said that cicada song is what thought sounds like when it realizes it cannot be remembered. You suspect he wrote that after too many hours without sleep. Still, you write it down in the margin of your blotter? What if the sound of dying is just memory reheard? It's too clumsy for a real poem, but you keep it. Sometimes first lines arrive awkwardly, like guests who knock with their elbows. Your brush hovers over the paper. The poem does not come. You write anyway. Not the poem you imagined, but the one that emerges in its place. A few words about shadows moving across paper. Something about reflection. Something about the ink refusing to dry quickly enough, as if it too is reluctant to commit. You pause. Not because you're dissatisfied, though you are, but because it's beginning to feel more like performance than honesty. You don't want to perform thought. You want to record it. There's a difference, subtle but essential, like the one between mist and fog. One softens, the other erases. A small moth lands on the edge of your scroll. You watch it quietly. It does nothing but clean its antennae, oblivious to your struggle. For a moment you envy its certainty. You wonder if it sees the ink as river or shadow. You wonder if it thinks at all. Probably not. You resist the urge to write about it. You've already written 3 too many poems about moths this year, and the literary circle in town has started to joke about it. One even composed a haiku mocking your mothful melancholy. You laugh politely, but you remembered. Still, you watch the moth. When it leaves the paper beneath, it is unmarked. But something has changed. You return to your brush. You write one sentence, not a poem. It reads, "There is nothing to say, and yet everything waits for me to speak." You sit with that for a while. It's not a great line. It might not even be a good one. But it is yours. And today, that is enough. Historians still argue whether Ming Dynasty scholars genuinely revered the ink-making ritual, or simply found in it an excuse to delay writing. There are accounts that suggest both that the most esteemed poets spent hours perfecting their ink while composing nothing at all, and others who use the ritual as a kind of mindfulness, a way to settle the self before anything true could be born on the page. You believe both, and neither, because some days the ink is the poem, and some days the poem is just the reason you got out of bed. You set down your brush and fold the unfinished sheet, not because it is finished, but because you are. The light outside has gone soft. The room smells of ink and dust and intention. You close the paper doors. The cicadas have begun to slow. You carry the folded scroll to the cedar drawer beside your desk and place it atop a stack of others, some complete many, not all beloved in the quiet way unfinished things often are. You do not look back at your desk. You leave the study without ceremony, because when the poem does not arrive, you learn to walk away with grace and wait for the next rain. By the time night falls again, you've convinced yourself that you're not waiting for inspiration, only for stillness. That's the lie every Ming scholar tells at least once a week. The moon hasn't risen yet. It lingers behind the roofline like a guest debating whether to knock. And the sky is a dark ink wash, diluted just enough to feel kind. You return to your favorite sitting place, a low stone bench beneath a gnarled pine, and bring only what you need. One scroll, one brush, and a teacup that you already suspect will be ignored. It's not ambition that brings you here tonight, it's something quieter. The desire to write not something brilliant, but something unfinished. You've grown fond of poems that end without answers. Unfinished poems have their own strange power. They don't trail off because the poet failed. They stop because they've said enough to make you lean in. The Ming scholars knew this. They weren't afraid of silence. They invited it to sit with them, even poured it tea. One master whose name you can't remember because he never signed his work once ended a verse with, "and then the wind turned." That was it. No resolution, no metaphor, just the implication of movement and a blank space where the reader could imagine what came next. You think about that often. Sometimes the best poetry is just a doorway left open. You begin writing before the ink has fully settled. The first character dries crooked. You let it stand. It feels honest. The poem starts as a meditation on leaves, but becomes something else by the second line. Something about absence, maybe? Or how shadows remember the shape of the thing that once blocked the light. You don't fight the drift. Your poems rarely stay where you place them. They're like cats that sleep in the ink box when you're not looking. Halfway through your third line, a soft breeze stirs the scroll. You steady it with your sleeve, but not before the brush slips, leaving a faint stroke of ink where no stroke was meant to be. You stare at it. A thin diagonal, meaningless on its own. Still wet, but drying quickly. You consider blotting it, then don't. Instead, you incorporate it. You break the rhythm of the poem. You skip a beat. You let the line wrap around the mistake, like a river curling around a rock. This, you decide, will be your signature poems that welcome interruption. The moon rises, finally pale and slow, like it's thinking about something it can't quite say. You look up and nod half respectfully, half in solidarity. The moon doesn't answer, but it doesn't need to. Its silence is generous, not empty. You return to your brush. Your hand moves less like writing and more like tracing something already there. Not a message, a mood. A way of saying, I felt this without needing to defend why. Your tea has gone cold again. You drink it anyway. It tastes like air that once hoped to be steam. The scroll is nearly full, but you don't want to end it. Not yet. Not properly. So you leave it dangling. You stop mid-thought. You write beneath the pine the wind, and let the ink run dry before finishing the sentence. It will drive someone mad one day, you think, and you feel oddly pleased. Let them wonder. Let them imagine what the wind might have done. Let the poem breathe in that open space. Historians still argue whether the practice of intentionally unfinished poems was a product of philosophical restraint or simply the result of too many scholars falling asleep mid-verse. Some believe it reflects Taoist ideals, emptiness as form, silence as completion. Others think it was a social signal, an unfinished line as an invitation to collaboration or proof of humility. Either way, the result is the same as scroll with space in it. A space where the reader must become a co-creator, must meet the poet halfway. You roll your scroll loosely. You don't sign it. You don't date it. Not because you're mysterious, but because you don't feel like explaining tonight. You place it beside you on the bench and lean back, letting the pine above you frame the stars like brushstrokes across black silk. You think about all the poems you haven't written yet and how many of them will also end before they're finished. It no longer worries you. You close your eyes, but only for a moment. The breeze returns softer now, less certain, like it's learned your habit of trailing off. You whisper the first line of your poem again, not to test it, but to hear how it sounds now that it's been written. Then you sit in the silence that follows, not waiting for the next line, just keeping the one you've written company. The air tonight is damp and clings to the cuffs of your sleeves like a memory that's forgotten why it showed up. You've taken to walking in the evenings again, not for exercise, not even to chase poetic thought, but because the garden path at night feels less like a place and more like a conversation partner. You step slowly, your shoes soft against the flagstones, though it hardly matters. Your hem is already soaked with the dew. A mild inconvenience, yes, but one you've come to accept. After all, what kind of Ming Dynasty scholar composes by moonlight and expects to stay dry? The garden is mostly silent, save for the intermittent sighs of frogs from the pond, the occasional rustle of a leaf giving up its grip, and the sound of your own exhale measured, and even not because you're calm, but because you've trained your breath to sound that way. Your lantern swings gently in your hand, casting a soft amber glow on the surrounding bamboo, and painting strange, elongated silhouettes across the path. In the day, you know this place like a map, but at night, it forgets its boundaries. Shrubs become strangers, stones become stories. The whole world rearranges itself to be slightly less sure of itself, and you quite frankly adore it for that. You pause near the moon gate, a perfect stone circle framing a section of plum trees now heavy with mist and shadow. You could walk through it, but you don't. Instead, you pull out your small writing scroll folded neatly inside your sleeve and perch on the edge of a low moss-covered step. Sitting in damp robes is not ideal, but tonight your thoughts are louder than your discomfort. You begin scribbling a verse about dripping leaves and forgotten paths. It's not your best work. The imagery leans heavily on metaphor, and even you are aware that regret like a reed is a phrase you've used twice this month. But the rhythm comforts you. It's familiar, safe. Halfway through your second stanza, a drop of water slides off a leaf and lands directly on your paper, not next to your characters on them. The ink blurs instantly. You sigh, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge fate's sense of humor. You dab the scroll with your sleeve, smudging the characters further in the process, and consider rewriting the whole thing. You don't. The ruined verse now looks strangely honest, like it was caught crying and made no effort to wipe its eyes. You set it aside and begin again. This time you write not about leaves or regret, but about dampness itself. The texture of it, the way it sneaks into your clothing, the sound it makes when your foot presses lightly on the grass. It's not poetic in the grand sense, but it's true. You're learning slowly that poetry doesn't always need to float. Sometimes it needs to sit heavily sodden and grounded and simply be about what it is. Historians still argue whether these moonlit walks were essential acts of poetic cultivation or just socially acceptable ways to avoid household chores. Some scholars describe their garden strolls as mindful perambulations for celestial communion, while others left behind suspiciously frequent references to slipping on moss, hinting that they spent more time landing in ponds than aligning with the stars. Whatever the case, the practice endured, wet hems, chilled fingers, and all. You take a moment to stretch your legs before continuing your walk. Your lantern flickers as a stronger breeze rolls through the garden. In the distance, you can hear someone in a neighboring courtyard cough a sound so ordinary, yet in this setting, it feels like a verse interrupted by an unexpected syllable. You smile. Not every poem needs silence. Some benefit from intrusion. You pass the old scholar's bench. No one sat there in years, not since he moved to the temple on the hill. But the stone still holds a faint warmth from decades of evening musings. You run your fingers across it, You think about leaving one of your scrolls tucked beneath it one night, just to see if it disappears. Just to see if poems like people can find their way to new homes. You write one final line before heading back inside. It's short, just 5 characters. You don't translate it, not even in your head. You let it be a secret between you and the damp night air. The kind of line that no one else might understand, but which carries the exact texture of your walk, soft, heavy, unfinished. Your robe clings to your knees as you step back into the courtyard. Your lantern sputters, once then recovers. A toad leaps across the path and disappears beneath a rock with the clumsy dignity of a creature that's made peace with its own awkwardness. You bow slightly to it because sometimes respect must be paid to those who move with purpose, even if they don't look the part. You dry your hands on the inside of your sleeve and place the wet scroll on the wooden bench by the door. You'll look at it in the morning. Or not. Maybe it will dry into something new. Maybe the smudge will teach you something your clean lines never could. Tonight, you fall asleep with your legs still a little damp and the faint scent of moss clinging to your skin. But you sleep deeply. Because sometimes the best poems are the ones that insist on being written even when the weather doesn't cooperate. And sometimes damp sleeves are just part of the process. You wake to the sound of cranes again, long lilting cries that echo across the pond and linger in the courtyard air like forgotten lines of verse. They're not loud, but they are insistent, and they carry the unmistakable tone of a creature that believes its own melancholy deserves a standing ovation. You roll onto your side on the thin, matte eyes still closed and listen, not just for the birds, but for the scholars who will no doubt gather later to argue again about whether cranes symbolize longing loss, serenity, or simply the desire to be dramatic at sunrise. There was an entire afternoon last month spent locked in debate over whether a poem describing a crane's shadow on the water was actually about lost friendship or just about a literal shadow. No one could agree. You suspect no one ever will. After a quick wash and a cup of ginger tea, not your favorite, but the only pot that hadn't gone bitter overnight, you step into the pavilion wearing your lightest robe, the gray one that crumples at the sleeves but never looks tired. The crane debate has already begun. 3 scholars are seated near the bamboo railing, each with a scroll in hand, each already committed to a position on the great crane discourse of the week. You bow, sit, and offer no opinion. Yet, because in this circle, timing is everything. The scholar to your right, Master Liu, believes cranes are the perfect embodiment of restrained emotion. They do not wail, he insists. They utter a single clear note, then move on. Like proper men. He says this while adjusting the lapel of his robe for the 4th time in 2 minutes, his fingers trembling slightly from what you assume is either passion or caffeine. Master Yuan, older and never seen without a cup of oversteeped oolong, snorts in disagreement. Restraint. No. Cranes are afflicted souls. They mourn. They keen. That call is the sound of unprocessed grief. He sips grimaces at his tea and keeps sipping. Across from him, the youngest of the group, barely 30, and already composing poems in 7 meters, leans forward. But what if he says the crane means nothing at all? What if we've burdened it with our metaphors, and it's simply trying to locate its mate? Silence falls. Not out of offense, but from the weight of the question. You stifle a smile. The suggestion that a symbol might not symbolize anything is a dangerous idea in this circle, but also an exciting one. You sip your own tea. It tastes faintly of last night's rain. You write a line in your mind. A crane flies past the argument unmoved. You don't say it aloud. Yet, the debate continues, winding now into historical references. Master Liu quotes a Tang Dynasty poet who once claimed cranes were born from the dreams of widows. Master Yuan counters with a line from a song verse describing a crane's reflection as the final note of a forgotten melody. The youngest scholar points out correctly that no living person has ever seen a crane and thought of music. You all stare at him. He shrugs, unrepentant. Historians still argue whether these kinds of debates were serious or simply scholarly, sport ritualized games of language, an illusion that allowed Ming poets to prove their erudition without directly insulting each other. Some records suggest scholars took their metaphors to near-comical extremes, crafting multi-page essays about the moral superiority of certain animals over others. One particularly heated argument reportedly ended with a scholar swearing never to include a duck in his verse again. You'd believe it. You finally offer your thought, not a side, but a question. What if the crane isn't the subject at all? What if it's the pause in the poem, the space around the metaphor? The others fall silent again, not because they disagree, but because it forces them to shift perspectives. Master Yuan mutters, That's very evocative. Master Liu nods slowly. The youngest writes it down in the corner of his sleeve. And just like that, the debate ends. Not resolved, but satisfied. It dissolves into more comfortable silence, the kind that follows a shared meal or a long sigh. You lean back watching the cranes across the pond, one of which stands perfectly still with its beak tilted just slightly skyward, as if waiting for someone to paint it. You wonder if it hears the conversation, if it knows it's being translated into longing serenity and unresolved grief by men who will never agree on its meaning. Probably not. Probably it just wants breakfast. You take out your scroll and write a line. Even the crane is tired of being discussed. Then cross it out. Too clever. You replace it with stillness beneath the cry. The pond says nothing. Better? You leave the rest of the page blank. Let it speak on its own. Later, as you're returning to your study, you pass the courtyard wall where several old poems are pinned with bamboo slivers. One of them is yours. One of them is Master Liu's. They both mention cranes. Neither mentions the argument. You pause, consider tearing yours down, then don't. You smooth the edge instead, brushing away a leaf that had stuck to it during the night. You walk slowly back inside, scroll still in hand, your mind circling around the idea that maybe the poem isn't in the words at all. Maybe it's in the silence between opinions, the space where a crane calls and no one says what it means. You'd think with all this talk of poetic discipline and scholarly serenity, the courtyard would be a place of pristine elegance where even the bugs buzz in hexameter and the breeze carries the scent of enlightenment. But tonight, as you lower yourself onto the stone bench by the lotus pond, with the noble intention of beginning a reflective verse about cloud shadows and aging bamboo, you're immediately ambushed by a mosquito the size of a regrettable metaphor. It lands on your wrist with the confidence of someone who's read your last poem and found it lacking. You slap it, miss, slap again, still miss. The poem is already ruined. You sigh, not the sigh of a man who has lost inspiration, but the sigh of someone who knows this entire evening is now going to smell like sandalwood because the only countermeasure left is incense. You light a stick and wave it like a sword against an invisible enemy. The smoke curls upward in lazy spirals that somehow look more composed than anything you've written all week. The irony is not lost on you. The incense smells expensive because it is. A rare blend brought by a fellow poet from Suzhou, containing hints of Agarwood star anise and the faint fictional aroma of scholarly clarity. It was supposed to calm your spirit, realign your internal poetic compass, and perhaps convince your elbow to stop cracking every time you reach for your ink brush. Instead, it's mostly just convincing the mosquitoes to aim for your ankles instead of your neck. You take a sip of tea. It's lukewarm again. You make a mental note to start drinking your tea faster, but you won't. You never do. A line forms in your head. The scent of sandalwood chases thought from the room. It's not bad. You write it down in the margin of an older scroll, just below a crossed-out poem about envy and pine cones. You reread it, consider tweaking the second character, then decide the entire line might actually be better without words at all. You draw a small square around it and label it Invisible Stanza. No one will understand. That's fine. Behind you, a cricket joins the evening with an enthusiasm that borders on indecent. It chirps in a rhythm that doesn't match your thoughts, your brushstrokes, or anything remotely poetic. You try to ignore it, but the pattern changes now. It sounds like it's laughing. At you. You glance over your shoulder. No one there. Just the night and the cricket and your overactive sense of persecution. Historians still argue whether incense rituals during the Ming Dynasty were truly intended to heighten poetic clarity, or were merely an excuse to own wildly overpriced scented sticks. Some surviving records describe incense competitions where scholars would gather and attempt to identify scents blindfolded. Others suggest incense was a kind of social code, an unspoken commentary on mood status or internal angst. You suspect the truth, as always, lies somewhere in between sincere ritual and extravagant coping mechanism. You shift on the bench. Your foot brushes something in the grass. A small wooden box, your incense tin left from the night before. You pick it up and open it. The last stick lies nestled inside, patient and perfect, like a story you forgot to tell. You hesitate, then light it. A second swirl of smoke rises beside the first, and for a moment the two streams spiral around each other, dancing like old friends who remember a joke no one else gets. You dip your brush again. The ink is just right now thick, but not sluggish. You begin a new line this time about smoke. about how it never moves in a straight line, about how it forgets the shape of the stick that birthed it. You pause. Is that too dramatic? Maybe. You let it stand anyway. The mosquitoes have mostly backed off. Either the incense is finally working, or they've decided you're more trouble than you're worth. Either way, you're grateful. You uncurl your legs, stretch your back, and whisper the beginning of your new poem aloud. Smoke leans where memory does not. The cricket falls silent. Coincidence, perhaps. You choose to believe it's a compliment. You remain on the bench until the smoke dies. The tea cools into oblivion, and the words begin to lose their urgency. You write one last note at the edge of the scroll, Sandalwood 1. Mosquitoes, possibly 12. Poem unmeasurable. You tuck the scroll into your sleeve and rise your limbs stiff, but your mind oddly soothed. On the way back inside, you pause beneath the pine tree and glance up. The sky has cleared completely. The moon is not yet out, but the stars are vivid, tiny incandescences, punctuating the soft grammar of the night. You think about writing a haiku about them, but decide not to. For once, you let something beautiful go unrecorded. You step through the threshold of your study and leave the sandalwood smoke to drift alone in the garden, like the final thought of a poet who got too tired to finish the line. You don't look for the moon tonight. It finds you anyway. Slipping gently through the lattice of your study window, it spreads across the scroll-littered desk like spilled rice wine, uninvited, luminous, and impossible to clean up. You pause mid-brushstroke eyes, lifted toward the sudden glow, and the poem you were writing something about plum blossoms and impermanence immediately starts to feel self-important. The moon, as usual, doesn't care about your metaphors. It has its own script older than ink, written in the shifting hush of silver light and the sighs of insomniac scholars. You lean back in your chair. The poem can wait. What you're witnessing now is an aesthetic ambush. The moonlight isn't dramatic, it's soft, contemplative, the kind of illumination that doesn't want applause, only attention. It pools on the wooden floor, slips into the corners of the room, glints off the rim of your teacup, like it's offering commentary on your decision to let the leaves steep too long. You watch as it lands finally on the lacquered box of old writings beneath your shelf. The box is labeled rather generously, completed works. You haven't opened it in weeks. You hesitate, then rise. Opening the box feels ceremonial, even though you know its contents are mostly drafts too, overworked to fix or too delicate to abandon. You leaf through them. The titles alone tell you who you were when you wrote them. Reflections on Still Water. Ambitious letter to a lost crane, melancholy complaint about tea. Misfiled as allegory, unintentionally popular at the last poetry reading. You unfold one scroll, the edges curled like the memory of something that once mattered. The first line reads, "Even clarity must cast a shadow." You don't remember writing it, but you like it. You trace the characters with your finger. The moon moves, slightly illuminating another scroll. You pull it out blank. Just paper. Stored there by accident or intent, you're not sure. You lay it flat on the desk and stare at it, letting the light and silence settle around you like a shawl. You dip your brush. You hesitate. And then, because you can't help it, you begin again. The first line isn't inspired. It's uncertain. But it carries the right weight, the kind of phrasing that doesn't announce itself, but simply waits to be noticed. You write slowly, spacing your characters wider than usual. The moonlight makes everything feel more ceremonial, as though each stroke is not merely ink on paper, but an offering to something older than poetry. You pause midway through the second stanza, sensing that you're no longer writing alone. The presence of the moon, not as object, but as observer, adds pressure, a kind of gentle accountability. You want your lines to deserve its gaze. Historians still argue whether the moon served as a literal muse for Ming Dynasty poets, or simply a convenient symbol around which they wrapped their longing, their scholarship, and their complex relationships with time. Some scholars suggest moon-gazing was a kind of moral act, a way of attuning oneself to the natural rhythms of the world. Others think it was a form of escapism, a nightly ritual of pretending that the sky held answers to questions ink could never phrase. You lean toward both. The moon, like most symbols, says exactly what the poet needs it to. Your brush falters. You pause to sip your tea. Cold again. Of course. You wonder if anyone has ever written a good poem while their tea was still hot. Probably not. Hot tea demands attention. Cold tea allows reflection. You scrawl that in the margin and immediately regret it, then smile, then leave it there. The scroll is nearly full now. You've described the shape of silence, the weight of solitude, the way the moonlight falls on a half-read scroll. None of it rhymes. All of it feels true. You glance down and realize your sleeve has trailed through a wet blot of ink. There's now a perfect black smear just above your wrist. You contemplate wiping it off, then decide it's better left there. A mark of participation. Proof that you were here writing in the presence of something vast and unbothered. You close the inkstone and set the brush down with the same care you'd use to set a sleeping bird on its perch. You don't read the poem again. Not now. It's still too alive. You'll let it cool overnight. Let the moon do with it what it will. Tomorrow in the harsh daylight, it may seem overwrought or incomplete, but right now it breathes. You rise, stretch, and glance once more at the open window. The moon is higher now, framed perfectly by the crisscross of wooden lattice. You bow slightly, not to the moon itself, but to the moment, and to yourself for showing up to meet it. Back on your mat, sleep does not come quickly. Your mind is still full of phrases that didn't make it onto the scroll images that arrived too late or too early. But there's peace in that. You've written what you could and left space for what remains unspoken. That too is part of the poem. And somewhere outside the moon continues this quiet sweep, indifferent and patient shining, just as brightly on the scholars who are still awake as on those who gave up hours ago. The scroll was never meant to reach the pond, and yet there it goes fluttering from your hands like a startled leaf carried by a sudden gust that you will later swear didn't exist until the very moment your fingers loosened. It hovers for one breathless second, catching the sunlight in a way that makes it look briefly like something sacred, then lands with a soundless splash near the pond's edge. You stand there motionless, brush still in hand, the last character you wrote, drying into incompletion. There's a moment where you believe you can pretend it didn't happen, that maybe the scroll will float back. It does not. You kneel carefully at the water's edge. The scroll bobs serenely just out of reach, trailing delicate loops of ink into the pond like forgotten dreams. The words half a morning's worth of poetic effort are already dissolving. You hesitate to grab it, not because you fear embarrassment, but because truthfully it looks quite beautiful. The paper unfurling in the water like the soft belly of a koi, the characters unraveling themselves like shy dancers. You've never seen a poem decay in real time before. You watch it for far longer than you should. Eventually, with as much dignity as one can muster when ankle-deep in a pond, while chasing their own failed metaphor, you retrieve what remains of the scroll. It comes apart as you lift it half in your hand, half left behind in the water's gentle ripple. You stand soaked, holding dripping parchment that now resembles the inside of a forgotten tea bag. The poem is gone, and so, apparently, is your afternoon. You return to your study barefoot. Your shoes, victims of your pond rescue, lie abandoned by the reeds. You carry the scroll remains like a relic of a private tragedy, unsure whether to laugh or mourn. You spread the damp fragments across your desk. One line remains intact. A leaf does not argue with the wind. You stare at it half in awe, half in despair. You didn't write that line. You're fairly certain it wasn't part of the original poem, which means the scroll in its disintegration composed something better than you did. Historians still argue whether Ming scholars were genuinely prone to such dramatics, or if tales like these were exaggerated by later biographers desperate to romanticize the poetic process. Stories abound of scrolls lost to fireflies, ink, eaten by goats, or poems ruined by jealous breezes. Some believe these tales are symbolic metaphors for impermanence. Others suggest the poets were simply clumsy. Tonight you lean toward the latter. With one foot still drying by the hearth, you feel less like a philosopher and more like a man who should have weighted his paper better. The evening arrives gently unaware of your earlier catastrophe. You sit by the window in your second-best robe, the good one still drying from its unexpected swim, and begin composing a new piece. Not to replace the lost poem, nothing can but to acknowledge it. You write about water, about how it takes what it wants, about ink that floats, about characters that melt before they're finished being read. The new poem is looser, less structured. There are no formal rhymes, no strict couplets, just fragments that feel like thoughts halfway whispered. One line in particular surprises you. A story only ends when the page refuses to hold it. You write it, read it, then sit very still. It's not brilliant, but it's honest. You think about leaving the poem unfinished as a gesture toward the scroll that never got to finish its thought. You draw a single black line where the next stanza would be. Not a word, just the line. It feels like closure, or at least companionship. Later that night, you sit on the edge of your porch, watching moonlight ripple across the pond's surface. You imagine the missing lines of your scroll swirling beneath the water, taken in by the fish or dissolved into stories the frogs might hum. You try not to be precious about it. After all, you're a scholar of the subtle. You understand that the things we try hardest to preserve are often the first to float away. Still, there's a pang. A small one. The ache of having said something to the world and having the world reply gently but firmly, "No thank you." You take comfort in the idea that somewhere a fish is swimming through your ruined poem, pausing now and then at a word it doesn't understand. Maybe that's all writing is, offering thoughts to creatures who will never read them in languages they don't speak. You smile finally. Not everything needs to last. Some things are meant to drift. There's no formal invitation, no bell chime, no folded note passed discreetly during tea. And yet, when the sun dips low and the lanterns begin to glow, you find yourself drifting toward the West Pavilion, drawn by the faint clatter of porcelain, the distant laugh of someone trying to sound modest, and the unmistakable aroma of cold tea and roasted chestnuts. Tonight, a few fellow scholars have gathered, nothing official, nothing ceremonial, just a quiet, unscheduled meeting where the goal is not debate but poetry, specifically reading it aloud, sipping lukewarm drinks, and pretending not to care what anyone thinks. You arrive just as Master Yan is finishing his second line, something about wind and nostalgia that sounds far too rehearsed. He's brought a fresh scroll unwrinkled, and you already suspect he practiced this verse while walking laps around his lotus pond all afternoon. He sits back with a satisfied nod as the others murmur their appreciation, all of them doing that slow, performative nodding that says, "Yes, I too have experienced longing." You settle beside the low table and accept a porcelain cup of something warm and indistinct, tea or broth or water, with ambition. Your own scroll is tucked into your sleeve. It's not new, not even recent, but you brought it because tonight's air felt like the kind of evening where you might want to remember that version of yourself, the one who wrote late into the night without worrying whether the characters lined up straight or whether the meaning could be understood at all. The version of yourself that didn't write for the applause of peers, pretending to sip tea thoughtfully, just for the page, for the quiet sound the brush made when it slowed. Master Lu reads next. His poem is about plum blossoms as always. No one dares mention that he's written 43 plum blossom poems in the past year. Instead, someone politely inquires about the symbolic interpretation of frost. You sip your tea. It tastes like over-explained metaphor. Then they turn to you. There's no pressure. Just the soft pause that says, now perhaps you unfold your scroll slowly. Not dramatically, this is not theater. But reverently, the paper is slightly worn, a corner bent. You clear your throat and begin. The first line is soft. The room stills. The second line quieter. By the third, no one is nodding anymore. They're listening, really listening. Because the lines aren't polished, they're present. You speak of a teacup left out overnight, the condensation that formed along the rim, the way its silence spoke louder than your thoughts. You don't say what it means. You let the image hang, and it does. Historians still argue whether Ming poetry readings were truly about literary exchange, or merely subtle one-upmanship disguised as enlightenment. There are letters that describe gatherings where verses were praised with faintly veiled sarcasm, and scrolls were accidentally misplaced on purpose. But there are also quiet accounts of scholars who shared their most vulnerable lines by lantern light, not because they wanted to be admired, but because they didn't want to be alone with their words anymore. You prefer to believe in both. Your voice softens as you reach the end. The last line is unfinished. You left it that way on purpose. Just a half line of brushstrokes trailing into the margin. A few characters, a thought paused mid-breath. You lower the scroll. No one speaks immediately. The silence is not discomfort, it's digestion. And then Master Yan clears his throat and says, "You should read that last line again." You do. This time it lands differently. Someone pours you more tea. Someone else moves a candle slightly so the light doesn't fall too harshly on the page. The night resumes slowly, tenderly, as if recognizing that it's been given something it didn't know it needed. The scrolls circulate. Poems shared. Some are precise and technically brilliant. Others meander like lazy streams. One poem is clearly plagiarized from a Tang Dynasty anthology, but no one says anything because the reading is good and the tea is flowing. By the third round, the poetry has softened. So have the poets. Master Lu makes a joke about writing his 44th plum blossom verse, and everyone laughs, including you. You glance down at your scroll. The ink has dried. The words feel less like performance now and more like fingerprints. You consider writing another line. You don't. The moment has already said everything. You tuck the scroll away. Later, as the gathering dissolves and slippers scuff back across the stone floor, you find yourself lingering. Not for more poetry, not for more tea, just for the quiet. The way the lanterns sway gently in the night air. The way someone leaves a half-filled cup on the table, not to be wasteful, but because the sip that was needed has already been taken. You return to your quarters without speaking. No one needs to ask how you're feeling. The words you left on the scroll have already said it. And as you blow out your candle and settle beneath the blanket, your mind whispers the line that never made it to the page. It doesn't need to now. The air already remembers it. You don't plan to write tonight. That's important. That's how it always begins on the nights when you swear you're only going to sit, quietly drink tea, and watch the lantern light pool on the tiles like fallen moons. You even tell yourself out loud, as if it will help anchor the decision tonight is for rest. Your brush remains capped. The inkstone is closed and shelved. You've turned down 3 invitations to discuss a new anthology of melancholic riverside verse, and instead you've settled into your favorite low-back chair by the open window robe, loosened feet bare. The evening is warm, thick with the kind of breeze that makes pages flutter, but doesn't demand attention. It's the sort of night that hums with ease. And then the thought arrives. It doesn't knock. It doesn't even fully form. Just a whisper, a phrase without context, a flicker of image, the ghost of a metaphor. But it lands in your mind like a drop of ink on untouched paper, soft, small, irreversible. You sit up already, halfway reaching for the brush you promised not to touch. No, you murmur. But the brush is already in your hand, and the ink is already finding its texture again. One accidental thought has undone your rest. You open a scroll without ceremony. No deep breath, no preparation. You simply begin writing the same way someone begins humming a tune they don't yet recognize as their own. The first line is nothing special. You don't try to impress yourself. It's about a door left ajar, a moth, unsure whether to enter. The second line arrives before you can question the first. Then a third. Soon it's clear you've stumbled into a poem you didn't know was waiting. The rhythm feels different tonight. You're not writing in the tight measured stanzas you usually favor. These lines stretch, they hesitate, they breathe, and halfway through you realize what you're doing. You're telling the truth, not about something profound, about something small. The way your fingers felt when you touched the edge of a cold teacup this morning. The hesitation in the lantern's flicker. The moment just before you forgot what you were trying to say. Nothing dramatic. Just fragments of perception gathered like loose coins. And then it happens. Your brush slips. Not a lot, just enough to drag a long, accidental line through the center of your 6th character. A single twitch of the wrist, a sneeze of the paper, or perhaps the air itself decided it had something to say. The damage is immediate. The word is ruined. And because of how the brush caught the grain, the ink trails out in an unintended flourish that makes the line look frankly ridiculous. You stare at it. You curse gently. You consider rewriting the entire poem, but instead you stare at the crooked mark and find yourself smiling, because the mistake has a kind of charm. The ruined character now looks like a branch bent under snow, or a bird landing badly, and instead of discarding the scroll, you pick up the brush again and begin writing around the error. Not to hide it, but to include it. You describe the crooked line. You give it a name. You imagine it as the moment where the poem stumbles and then laughs at itself. You lean into the error, and the rest of the lines follow suit. They stop pretending to be graceful. They begin to slouch, to lean against the edges of the page, to yawn mid-thought. You write a verse about forgetting the kettle was boiling, a couplet about falling asleep mid-recitation, a final line about ink dripping onto the floor unbothered. Historians still argue whether Ming Dynasty scholars truly welcomed imperfection or merely wrote about it in ways that sounded wise. There are scrolls preserved in museum drawers where crossed-out verses sit beside newly formed lines, evidence of humility or indecision no one can quite say. Some scholars insisted that flawed calligraphy revealed the deeper soul. Others insisted it just revealed bad posture. Either way, the idea took root that maybe poetry was never meant to be perfect. Maybe it was meant to be human. You finish the poem and read it back. The crooked line still stands. Proud, absurd, and deeply honest. You don't date this one. You don't name it. You simply roll it, tie it with string, and place it beside the others. Not because it's beautiful, but because it's true. Outside, the wind picks up. Your candle gutters and dies. The shadows lean in, curious. You sit back again in the chair you swore you wouldn't leave now. A little ink-stained, a little smug, a little sleepy. And as your eyes begin to close, you think about the crooked character. You wonder how many mistakes you've erased that were trying to help you say something real. Tonight you let one stay. And somehow that makes all the difference. Clouds weren't invited, but they've shown up anyway. Unruly guests dragging their swollen bellies across the sky just as you unfold your scroll and set your inkstone down with quiet ceremony. The moon was supposed to rise unobstructed tonight, its full face promised by every calendar and every giddy prediction from the younger scholars who'd been planning to compose its praises for days. You yourself spent the better part of the afternoon preparing. You selected your brush, carefully steeped a small pot of chrysanthemum tea, even sprinkled dried osmanthus petals on the ledge of your writing alcove, as if that might encourage celestial cooperation. But now, the clouds roll in like a herd of sheep who've missed their cue and decided to graze over the moon until further notice. You try to ignore them at first. You sip your tea, adjust your sleeve, reposition your brush, with the delicacy of a man trying not to betray irritation. You recite the opening line of your poem aloud. Moonlight spills across the garden path like spilled. And then stop, because the metaphor feels obvious. And more pressingly, the moonlight has now disappeared entirely. What's left is not darkness, but a kind of soggy, ambient nothing. The garden is still there, of course, and so are you. And so is your half-written poem, but the moment has taken its coat and slipped quietly out the back. You consider writing anyway, forcing it. Plenty of poets do. Master Shen once completed an entire ode to an eclipse by candlelight, and nobody ever called him a fraud. But you can't bring yourself to do it. The moon was your subject, your partner, your silent silver co-author. Writing about it now would feel like invoking the name of a guest who left the party hours ago. You sigh, set down your brush, and stare up at the bloated sky. Historians still argue whether poets of your era truly depended on moonlight as a muse, or whether the tradition of writing by its glow was more aesthetic than functional. Some believe moonlight served as a metaphorical device, a stand-in for clarity, distance, or longing. Others insist the poets genuinely could not write without it, that the absence of its pale gaze disrupted their rhythm and made their verse feel like it had arrived to the wrong address. Tonight, you believe the latter. Or maybe you're just sulking. The tea cools beside you. You forget to drink it. The clouds refuse to budge. You begin to wonder whether they're doing it on purpose. Perhaps they read your first line and were unimpressed. Perhaps this is their protest, their gentle gray veto. You almost admire it, the audacity of the sky to reject your poem before it's even finished. You try to distract yourself with other observations. The breeze rustling the bamboo in the corner, the way the candlelight makes your ink pot glow like a tiny cauldron, the fact that someone has left an old scroll tucked under the bench, forgotten and half crushed. You reach for it out of boredom, then curiosity. The paper is thin, the writing old and water damaged. The characters are smudged and difficult to read, but you make out the title, When the Moon Did Not Appear. You blink, then laugh. Not loudly, not bitterly. Just a quiet, breathless laugh. The kind that feels like sharing a joke with the past. You unroll the scroll, carefully reading what you can. The author had also planned to write a poem by moonlight. The clouds had come. The moon had vanished. The poem became instead a meditation on patience, on the absurdity of expectation, on how even the most carefully laid out inkstones sometimes go unused. The final line reads, "Perhaps the moon too needs a night off." You sit with that. Perhaps it does. Perhaps tonight was never about the moon at all. Perhaps the real poem was meant to be written in this pause, in the irritation, in the waiting, in the way you now feel a strange kinship with a poet who lived generations before you, who also once stared at a cloudy sky and considered scrapping the whole thing. You don't write a new poem, not tonight, but you do copy down that final line quietly with care. You set the old scroll beside your own, fold your hands in your lap, and lean back in your chair. The clouds stay, the moon doesn't return, but neither do you feel the need to ask it to. It starts innocently enough, a comment about chrysanthemums. You're seated beneath the old pine in the scholar's garden, enjoying the last light of afternoon with a cup of rice wine you definitely poured more generously than usual. The conversation is meandering, half about verse, half about nothing, and everyone's comfortably settled into that low-stakes kind of mood that usually signals a peaceful evening ahead. Then Master Shun leans back, sips from his cup, and says almost lazily, Of course, the chrysanthemum is the truest flower of autumn. You pause, so does Master Hui. Master Hui's lip twitches just slightly, but enough. He adjusts his robe and sets his cup down as if preparing to challenge a military stratagem, not a floral opinion. You mean in color, perhaps, he says. Certainly not in feeling. A long silence follows. You glance toward the chrysanthemums blooming in neat rows just beyond the pavilion, delicate, gold-petaled sturdy against the cold, and then at the single plum tree further down the path, still weeks away from flowering. You know what's coming. You've seen it before. This will not end with agreement. It will end as all great Ming poetic feuds do with several scrolls. Some raised eyebrows and at least one dramatic walk around the lotus pond. Master Shun straightens. In both color and character, the chrysanthemum withstands the frost. It bends but doesn't break. It waits out the cold and blooms brighter because of it. It's the emblem of inner strength. No other autumn flower endures so quietly. Master Hui doesn't blink. That is precisely why it fails. Endurance is not the soul of poetry, longing is. The plum blossom dares to appear in winter's harshest breath. It doesn't endure. It defies. It is loneliness made visible. You sip your wine. Slowly. The two men lock eyes, and you know the night's tone has shifted. No longer the easy chatter of passing thoughts. This is now a matter of aesthetic philosophy, which, in the world of Ming scholars, is only one level below actual warfare. Historians still argue whether poetic flower symbolism debates like this one were serious or simply intellectual sport. Some say these were performances, ways for scholars to show their grasp of metaphor, Confucian ethics, and personal restraint. Others suggest the arguments were deeply personal coded expressions of political alignment or emotional confession. It's been said that one famed poet lost an entire year of correspondence with his rival because of a disagreement over whether lotus flowers could be described as shy. You believe it. Master Jun has launched into a citation-laden defense of chrysanthemums. He references Tao Qian, always a safe move, describing how the poet cultivated them not for beauty, but for peace. Master Hui counters by quoting a lesser-known song verse that likens plum blossoms to whispers in snow. The air grows thicker with elegance and veiled insults. At one point, someone tries to steer the topic back to last night's moon, but it's too late. The flower debate has rooted itself. You don't intervene. You simply observe. You know that tomorrow both men will write verses, possibly several. They'll circulate them in the usual polite way, claiming to offer reflections while clearly attempting to eviscerate the other with calligraphic grace. And you poor bystander will be asked delicately repeatedly which you find more resonant. You consider faking a hand injury. As the sky deepens into velvet, Master Hui stands bows and exits the pavilion with the dignified pace of someone who has absolutely not just been insulted. Master Shun refills his cup with a satisfied hum. You remain behind, sipping your own wine, thinking about the two flowers, about endurance and longing, about whether you've ever truly written about either. You've written about weather, about quiet, about moonlight and tea. But longing, you're not sure. So you pull a fresh scroll from your sleeve, dip your brush, and write, "The plum speaks when no one is listening." You stare at the line. Then write, "The chrysanthemum listens when no one is speaking." You let both stand. The wind picks up. You set down your brush and let the scroll dry in the breeze. You don't need to pick a side tonight. The flowers will still bloom whether or not you argue over their meaning. And maybe they bloom best when no one's watching at all. The scholar arrives wearing a robe made of goose feathers. Not metaphorically, actually goose feathers. Not sewn in, not embroidered. Layered. Flowing. Impractical. Each feather appears to have been pressed and lacquered, individually shimmering beneath the lantern light, as if he has just walked through a dream and possibly gotten a bit too invested in it. No one says anything for a full 30 seconds. You watch the feathers shift with each step he takes across the stone path, ruffling gently, as though his very thoughts are stirring the air. His name, you think, is Anne. He's come to join the Mid-Autumn Poetry Circle, which tonight has gathered in the moon-viewing courtyard, its pebbled floor freshly raked and his teacups already half full. His scroll is tucked neatly into one sleeve. His fan, also feathered, you note grimly remains closed. It's unclear whether he's here to read poetry or to declare himself emperor of migratory elegance. He bows low, the feathers swish. No one comments directly on the robe. That would be gauche. Instead, Master Jin simply murmurs, a bold choice which, in scholarly circles, is only 2 syllables removed from "Are you unwell?" and smiles. He clearly expects commentary. None comes. Instead, the group politely resumes its recitation. One by one scrolls our unrolled voices rise and fall with the cadence of practiced restraint. You read a short verse about mist on bamboo. It lands well. Master Hui recites a piece about a fishing village at twilight that leaves everyone a little too quiet. Then it is Anne's turn. He unrolls his scroll with a flourish that sends a few feathers tumbling from his sleeve like autumn leaves. He begins to read, and for better or worse, it's good. Actually, it's very good. The poem drifts from image to image, each one soft, surprising, perfectly measured. He writes of a crane landing on an empty page of wind, stealing a line before it can be read aloud. The language is fluid, unforced, and not a single metaphor feels overcooked. It's frustrating. You want to dismiss it as pretentious, but it's not. It's just better. Halfway through, someone sighs, not out of boredom, but envy. Historians still argue whether poets of the Ming Dynasty were more concerned with the elegance of their work or the elegance of their presentation. Some records describe scholars arriving to salons in understated robes, while others tell of embroidered silks, lacquered headdresses, and one infamous case of a man who read his poem while reclining on a floating platform covered in lilies. There is a long-standing debate as to whether these flourishes enhanced or obscured the meaning of the poetry itself. You are currently leaning toward obscured, but it's getting harder to justify that opinion. When it finishes, the silence that follows is not the kind born of confusion, but of slow, reluctant admiration. Even Master Jin nods. "Well paced," he murmurs, which from him might as well be a standing ovation. Anne smiles again, but this time there's no smugness. Just a feather falling from his collar and landing on the rim of your teacup like a punctuation mark. You spend the rest of the evening trying not to think about how good the poem was. Instead, you focus on your tea, which tastes a bit like envy. You reread your own lines in your mind and begin wondering whether mist was too obvious, whether your last metaphor about silence resting in the sleeve of night could be misread as laundry. You try to let it go, you fail. Later, after the crowd thins and the lanterns have dimmed, and approaches you. He bows again, more modestly this time. You expect a compliment. Instead, he says, "You left too much space between your third and fourth lines. It was a risk. It worked." You blink. He walks away before you can reply. You stare after him, slightly stunned, realizing two things at once. One, he read your scroll closely enough to comment on its spacing, and two, he did it without condescension. Somehow this man in a robe made of birds has just outscolared everyone without lifting his fan. You turn back to your scroll. You reread it, and strangely, you don't hate it anymore. Not because it's perfect, because someone saw the space in it and called it intentional. You have at some point in your scholarly life made the grave mistake of engaging the moon in a silent contest of willpower. Not publicly, of course. No one else needs to know. But tonight, as you sit cross-legged on the veranda, scroll in hand and brush hovering over the first line, it becomes clear you are locked in a staring match with the moon. And the moon being the moon is absolutely not going to blink. You began with confidence. The conditions were perfect, sky crisp, air still, silence generous. You poured your tea not too hot, chose your brush, soft tipped, lightly frayed, and positioned your scroll at precisely the angle that has always brought you luck. Then you looked up, and there it was, round, luminous, and to your increasing irritation, completely uncooperative. You tried to capture it in a line, a silver coin tossed into the lake of night. Too pedestrian, the cold eye of heaven, too dramatic, an old wound in the sky. You cringe. Not even a good metaphor for moonlight, just emotional weather disguised as poetry. You try again, and again. Line after line falters, nothing lands. The brush begins to feel heavier with each failed attempt. The scroll now looks like a battlefield of bad imagery and bruised intent, and still the moon stares back full-faced and smug, like it knows something you don't, like it's been watching generations of scholars make fools of themselves beneath its glow, and is quietly ranking you somewhere near the bottom. You set your brush down, not in defeat yet, but in pause. The moon remains. You sip your tea. It's gone cold as usual. You consider writing about that instead. Maybe the moon is just a distraction, and the real poem is in your own refusal to give up. You look down at the scroll again, reading the half lines you've written and abandoned. They're not terrible, they're just trying too hard. So you do what any rational Ming scholar would do in your situation, you personify the moon. You begin a new stanza, not about the moon as object, but as presence, a character, a critic. You write, She offers no praise, no warning, just watches pale with patience. That feels better. Less forced. You keep going. She doesn't weep for failed metaphors or cracked porcelain cups. She has seen them all. Historians still argue whether Ming Dynasty poets genuinely viewed the moon as a living interlocutor or merely used it as a recurring literary symbol. Some scholars suggest the personification was deeply sincere, a form of emotional projection onto a celestial body that never left. Others see it as a ritualized device, a way to mirror the poet's own moods through a convenient skyborn constant. Either way, the result is the same hundreds of verses scattered across scrolls and centuries, all trying to make the moon say something it never agreed to. You shift your posture and look up again. The moon hasn't moved, or rather, it has just enough to make you aware of the passage of time without giving you the satisfaction of poetic climax. You write a final line, she waits for nothing. That is why she stays. And that's it. No elaborate ending, no rhyme, just an observation that for once doesn't feel like it's competing with the heavens. You set the scroll aside feeling oddly relieved. Not triumphant, but finished. The breeze picks up, the scroll flutters, and the moon, still silent, still pale, seems for the briefest moment less like an opponent and more like a companion who never promised comfort, only company. You bow your head not to her but to the stillness that followed your writing. And then you blow out the candle, stretch your sore legs, and shuffle inside, leaving the moon exactly where she was when you arrived. Unimpressed. And entirely enough. By now the scrolls have accumulated. Dozens of them rolled tightly and tied with silk cords, rest in bundles on your desk and drawers beneath cushions. Even wedged behind that useless decorative lute no one plays anymore. Each scroll contains some version of the moon, the wind, the passing of time, and one increasingly recurring image of a half-finished teacup. Tonight, though, you're not here to write another poem. Tonight, you are chasing something smaller, a shadow. More specifically, the play of shadows cast by lantern light onto rice paper. You've noticed over the last few nights that when you leave your scrolls open under a swinging lantern, the flickering light draws moving silhouettes across the page shapes that weren't written but arrive anyway. At first you thought it was distraction, then coincidence, but now you believe it's instruction. The shadows seem to complete the words. One soft bend of light folds into your calligraphy like punctuation. Another sweeps over the brushstrokes just so. And suddenly a line about silence reads like a confession. So tonight you set out not to write, but to watch. You unroll a fresh sheet of paper and place it beneath the lantern. No ink, no brush, just paper and light. The lantern swings gently pushed by the draft through the open window. The flame dances its shadows, pulsing across the grain of the paper. You lean in. The shadows form the rough outline of bamboo swaying a corner of roof, the faint suggestion of a character you've yet to write. You stare at it for a long time. It's nothing, but it's there. And suddenly you realize this too is poetry. Not the words, the waiting. The willingness to let something arrive without pulling it into shape. You do eventually lift your brush, but instead of crafting a verse, you simply trace the moving light. Not precisely, not scientifically, just the suggestion of movement. A curve here, a hook there. Your brush glides softly, mimicking the rhythm of something that doesn't want to be caught. You don't try to make it mean anything. It's a gesture of recognition, a nod to what light and paper can say without you. Historians still argue whether these moments when scholars engaged with the environment as co-author were acts of inspiration or superstition. Some accounts describe entire poems built on the behavior of candle smoke or the echo of footsteps across tile. Others dismiss such efforts as indulgent poetic procrastination, but the best scrolls from this era often include curious flourishes, loops, and dips in the calligraphy that don't match the rest of the line, as though the poet allowed the ink to follow a sound or a shadow instead of logic. You shift your paper slightly. The lantern shifts with it. This time the shadow looks like a boat drifting across a river. You remember a poem you once abandoned, 3 lines about a ferry crossing fog. You reach for it now halfway murmured in your mind and write, "The boat forgets its oars. The river keeps carrying it." You don't care that it doesn't match the rest of the page. You leave it there. Not everything must match. You blow gently on the page to dry it. The lantern dims slightly, smoke coiling up toward the rafters. For a moment the shadow flickers like a bird taking flight. You follow its curve with your eyes and find your hand reaching without thinking to write a final line the paper never asked to be a sky. You laugh softly, not at the line, at yourself. At the fact that you've spent 2 hours tracing lantern shadows and now have a scroll filled with half thoughts, none of which rhyme and all of which feel more honest than anything you wrote last week. You roll the scroll loosely, still damp in places, and tuck it into the empty vase beside your desk where you've been hiding your favorites. You do not read it again. You let the shadows keep whatever meaning they brought with them. And as you step away from the table, you notice that your hand is stained faintly with the ink in the shape of a crescent. You don't wash it off. Some poems belong on skin. Somewhere between the 7th and 8th line of your latest scroll, a cicada begins to scream. It's not a chirp. It's not a song. It's a full-throated, unrepentant howl, a kind of insect area that drowns out your thoughts, devours your silence, and immediately derails your already fragile train of poetic momentum. You freeze, brush, poise mid-stroke, unsure whether to continue or to launch a philosophical argument with a bug that clearly has no respect for literary composition. The screeching continues. You try to ignore it, telling yourself that nature is part of the process, that many great Ming verses were composed amid the buzzing of summer creatures. But this cicada is different. This cicada is loud. This cicada is personal. It's positioned somewhere just outside your window, invisible, but close enough that its shrillness seems to vibrate against the inside of your skull. You take a breath, you put down the brush, and you wait. It doesn't stop. You stand. Step outside. The sky is ink-black stars scattered like forgotten calligraphy practice. The garden is quiet except, of course, for the small vibrating agent of chaos hiding in the foliage. You pace slowly along the stone path, trying to locate it not out of vengeance, but curiosity. What is this creature singing for love territory? Some unspeakable insect grief. Eventually, you stop near the edge of the bamboo grove. You can't see it, but you can feel it. The scream has a direction. It buzzes against your ribs. You look up at the full moon and mutter, "Tell your friend to take a breath." The moon, as usual, offers no assistance. You return to your study. The scroll lies open on the desk. The ink has dried too quickly. The last character you wrote now looks brittle, like it was etched in sand. You sit, you stare at it. The cicada begins again. So you do the only thing left. You write about that. The ink flows faster now. Your brush, freed from its earlier constraints, begins to speak more directly. You write cicada wails from nowhere. My thoughts scatter like frightened birds. Then his grief is louder than mine and less embarrassed. You pause. The cicada continues. You continue too. The poem becomes something you didn't expect. Not about noise or bugs or frustration, but about interruption itself. About the way silence isn't always a given, and about how beauty sometimes insists on arriving through a scream. You write a stanza about a memory sitting with your grandfather beneath a similar moon, too young to understand his words, but old enough to remember the silence between them. You write about how, even then, cicadas were screaming. You wonder if they're always there when something important tries to happen. A kind of accidental chorus. A reminder that peace doesn't mean quiet. Historians still argue whether Ming poets welcomed these moments of intrusion as creative catalysts, or simply tolerated them as occupational hazards. One famous account tells of a scholar who penned his most revered verse during a locust swarm, comparing their frenzy to the clamor of unspoken thoughts. Another poet reportedly moved his writing table indoors for an entire summer, just to escape one particular cricket. There's little consensus on the correct response to being serenaded by insects, but tonight you've made your choice. You write until your wrist aches. You write until the cicada pauses, either satisfied or exhausted. You write until your final line reads, "He sang." I answered. We both meant it. You close the scroll. Not reverently, just naturally, like exhaling. You extinguish the lamp, and the darkness blooms gently around you. Outside, the garden is still holding its breath. You half expect applause. None comes. You smile. As you slip beneath your blanket, you find the hum of the cicada still echoing somewhere in your chest. Not irritating now. Anchoring. Sleep finds you before the silence does. Morning arrives, not with the gentle hush of a scholar's dawn, but with a loud and unapologetic thud, your ink jar rolling off the desk, and onto the floor, knocking into a pile of discarded scrolls, before coming to rest under your cot. You sit up slowly, rubbing your temple with the grace of someone whose dreams were more exhausting than restful. Your robe is twisted, your blanket is halfway across the room, and your hair is performing a small protest against the notion of composure. You are, in short, the exact opposite of the elegant poet your letters pretend you are. You shuffle to the mirror. What greets you is a face worn from a night of unfinished stanzas and one too many rewrites. Your eyes are smudged with ink, where you must have rubbed them mid-thought, and your right hand still holds the brush loosely, as though even your dreams refuse to stop editing. You pry it freeside dramatically, no audience, just muscle memory, and stumble toward the teapot. The tea predictably is cold. You drink it anyway. Outside, the day is already busy, pretending to be poetic. Birds chirp too loudly. Sunlight filters through the lattice just right. Someone is sweeping a courtyard rhythmically enough to be mistaken for meter. You don't trust it. Days that start like this are usually setting you up for some grand embarrassment, like forgetting the characters for reflection mid-sentence, or discovering your latest scroll was accidentally written on the back of your laundry tally. You dress, not carefully, just enough. You step outside barefoot because your slippers are missing, likely hiding beneath the scrolls you knocked over last night during your dramatic collapse into bed. The stone floor is cold, but honest. You take that as a sign. You begin your morning walk around the courtyard. It's your ritual now. Not for clarity, not for inspiration, just to prove you still know how to move in a straight line. Your joints crack with each step. Your robe is wrinkled. You pass a group of younger scholars seated near the garden wall, each perfectly groomed and deeply engaged in the process of pretending they are not watching you stagger by like a disheveled ghost of failed metaphor. One of them bows. You bow back. Historians still argue whether the disheveled morning poet is a myth or a reality. Some texts describe Ming scholars as pristine and composed from dawn to dusk, rising early to align their energy with the universe. Others depict them as bleary-eyed wanderers, still half-dreaming, brushing crumbs off their scrolls and muttering about misplaced couplets. You, it seems, are living proof that the second version lives on. You reach the bench under the ginkgo tree. Sit heavily. The world continues without you for a few minutes, which is its right. You close your eyes. A leaf lands in your lap, golden and veined, like a compliment from someone who doesn't speak your language. You pick it up, study it, and feel for a flicker of a second the faintest impulse to write. But you don't. Not yet. You wait. Instead of reaching for the scroll tucked into your sleeve, you reach for your sleeve itself. You smooth it out. Notice a stain, dried ink, perhaps tea. You don't remember. You trace it with your finger and wonder if anyone else ever starts their poems by cataloging stains. Probably not. Perhaps they should. You finally draw out your scroll and unroll it. The first line is already written. From last night, no. From a week ago. You forgot about this one. It reads, "Even in rest, the hand remembers how to ache." You smile, tiredly. You dip your brush. Not to create, but to continue. The poem that follows isn't your best. It doesn't need to be. It speaks of a morning too bright, tea too cold, and a face that has aged one metaphor at a time. It ends with, "The ink has gone dry, and so have I, but both will return when stirred." You fold the scroll, tuck it away, and return inside. Your slippers are still missing. You write a note about them on the margin of your blotter lost to literature, and then barefoot, but oddly whole, you begin your day. It was bound to happen eventually. You knew it the moment he opened his mouth, that silky, overly measured tone that scholars use when they're about to commit a literary crime with perfect politeness. He clears his throat. He raises the scroll, and then he begins to read your poem. Except not quite. The rhythm is off. The first line's been changed, replaced with something clunkier, more dramatic, unnecessarily stuffed with imagery that makes you wince. The second stanza is mostly intact, though he's swapped the phrase soft-spoken lantern for celestial blaze, which frankly sounds like a fire hazard. He skips a line entirely near the end, the best one, and adds a closing flourish. You would never have written too loud. Too obvious a metaphor delivered with all the grace of a goose, tripping over a zither. You glance around the courtyard. A few heads are nodding in appreciation. One person murmurs such restraint. You nearly drop your teacup. There's no question. He's taken your poem, maybe not word for word, but certainly breath for breath, and now he's reading it as his own with the serene face of a man who believes inspiration is public property, as long as he's the one inheriting it. You don't interrupt. That would be undignified. You've seen this happen before after all. Ming scholars have always walked a fine line between homage and theft, between inspired by and conveniently borrowed. You sip your tea, carefully, because if you open your mouth now, you may say something that lands you in a 2-month calligraphy duel. And frankly, your wrists still hurt from the last one. The reader finishes. He bows, scroll still in hand, eyes modestly downturned. And then, just to ensure your soul leaves your body completely, he adds, "This one came to me after a sleepless night under the moon. It felt given." You want to respond, yes, given by me. But you don't. Historians still argue whether poem plagiarism in the Ming era was truly frowned upon or simply part of the unspoken social game. Some believe sharing ideas was expected, even encouraged, as a form of reverent imitation. Others point to heated disputes, exile-worthy betrayals, and the famous case of a scholar who reportedly shaved his own head in shame after being caught reusing a plum blossom couplet. The truth likely lives somewhere in the middle, a place where pride and politeness coexist, awkwardly sipping tea and avoiding eye contact. After the reading, you walk alone through the bamboo grove. You don't fume, not quite. You rehearse rebuttals in your head, sure. You imagine standing and reciting the original verbatim with the subtlety of a thunderclap. But it's a warm evening. The wind is friendly. And deep down you know the poem you wrote still exists unchanged. Untouched on the scroll, tucked away in your second drawer, written in your own hand before anyone else gave it a name. You find a stone bench and sit. You write a new line, "The river does not miss the cup that tried to drink it." Then another, "Some hands take what they cannot carry." You pause. You don't want to become bitter. Bitterness spoils ink. It shows in the strokes, makes the lines sharp when they should be soft. You set your brush down. You close your eyes. You listen to the rustling of the bamboo, to the quiet world still unconcerned with stolen words. Later, as the stars begin to pin themselves across the sky, you write a short poem not about theft, but about echoes, about how some voices come back to you wearing unfamiliar shoes, walking paths you didn't choose for them. The poem is gentle. Disappointed, yes, but gentle. You end it with, "I wrote it once. I do not need to write it again." And you mean it. Sort of. It begins with a teacup. A simple porcelain teacup. Pale blue with a hairline crack that snakes along the base like a forgotten river. It wasn't particularly expensive. It wasn't gifted or inherited. It just was. You'd used it for years, without ceremony, setting it beside scrolls and inkstones like a quiet companion to your writing hours. Tonight, though, you drop it. It slips from your sleeve as you lean over to adjust a candle. A soft clink against the edge of your writing desk, followed by a slow-motion tumble, and then the unmistakable sound of finality, the sound of a thing that will never be what it was. You don't move at first, just stare at the shards, the curved lip, the delicate handle, the now ruined bottom that had once held so many nights of almost wisdom. You crouch down, gather the pieces. The crack you'd ignored for years has split completely, turning the teacup into a fragile puzzle, with one or two edges missing. You turn it over in your hand. It feels strange, familiar, but no longer dependable. You place the pieces on the windowsill beside a dried sprig of lavender. A brief memorial. No flowers, no eulogy. And then, of course, you write about it. The poem begins reluctantly, one line at a time. Not dramatic, not tragic, just quiet notes of recognition. You held every unfinished thought until one of us failed to hold the other. You surprise yourself. You're not sad exactly, just aware of impermanence, of how objects carry memory not in their price, but in the time they spend unnoticed. You sip from a different cup, too wide, too clean, too light in the hand. The tea tastes the same, but everything else feels off. Your rhythm falters. You rewrite the third line 3 times before giving up and leaving it blank. The crack in the poem mirrors the crack in the cup. You leave them both unpatched. Historians still argue whether scholars of your era genuinely grew attached to their tools, or whether the sentimentality is something we've projected backward onto them. There are mentions in private letters of brushes named like children inkstones kept warm in winter cloths, and teacups wrapped in linen after each use. Some dismiss these habits as affectation. Others argue that in a life dedicated to the subtlety of words, it makes sense to find comfort in small, steady things. You place the unfinished poem beside your inkstone and stare out the window. The wind has picked up. A scroll flutters. You pin it down with a pebble. The broken cup glints softly in the lamplight, no longer useful, but still beautiful in the way that only broken things sometimes are. You write one more line. A simple one, I won't glue it. I'll remember where it broke. And you will. Tomorrow you'll probably forget where you set your favorite brush. You'll misplace a poem you liked and find it months later inside a coat. But this little fracture will remain quietly etched into the rhythm of your days. You'll think about it when your new cup doesn't quite sit right, when your tea cools too fast, when your hand pauses before the next line. Not everything needs fixing. Some things just need to be witnessed. There's a moment in every scholar's life, usually around the seventh cup of tea, well past the hour when anyone should still be debating metaphor, when one is hit with a deep, inescapable realization you've lost the thread. Not of a poem, of everything. Tonight is that moment. You're seated in your study, surrounded by an impressive chaos of open scrolls, half-drained inkpots, and a constellation of tea stains that could easily be mistaken for a failed star map. You've been revisiting your older poems, an ill-advised endeavor, to begin with attempting to sort them into vague categories: still good needs work, and what was I thinking? Naturally, the third pile is now twice the size of the others. You pick up a scroll you don't even remember writing. The opening line reads, "The moon forgets my name, and I pretend not to mind." You snort. Whether from self-loathing or appreciation, even you aren't sure. The next few lines wander into territory best described as romantic confusion, dressed up as seasonal allegory, and by the time you reach the end, you're laughing. Not unkindly. Just in that way one laughs when catching a glimpse of their younger self, trying a little too hard to be profound. You lean back, rubbing your temples, and whisper into the room, "What am I even doing anymore?" The room, of course, does not reply. Historians still argue whether these crises of purpose were common among Ming Dynasty poets, or whether the carefully curated calm of their public scrolls masked an inner spiral of second-guessing and existential dread. One famous diary, found hidden in the wall of a scholar's retreat, contains 7 pages of increasingly erratic handwriting that simply repeats the phrase, "Is this a poem, or just a sentence with better shoes?" You feel a strange kinship with him. You rise, pace. Your robe drags a scroll off the desk. You leave it. You move to the window and look out, not for inspiration, but for reassurance that the world still exists beyond metaphors. The courtyard is bathed in moonlight. The plum tree sways. Somewhere someone is snoring gently. You envy their clarity of purpose. Eventually you return to your desk. Not because clarity has arrived, but because sitting feels more constructive than spiraling while standing. You pull out a fresh scroll. Not to start a masterpiece, just to see what happens. You begin writing a list. Not a poem, just a list of everything you've ever compared to moonlight. It gets long. You include a sigh through a paper door, the taste of cold jasmine, your father's silence during winter, a single rice grain left in a bowl. You pause. Realize none of them were wrong, but perhaps none of them were enough. You write one more line beneath the list, and still it remains unsaid. You breathe. That's it. That's the thread you'd lost. Not the poems themselves, but the permission to not finish them. The understanding that sometimes saying almost everything is as honest as you can be. You clean your brush. Not quickly, not dramatically, just with the quiet intention of someone who is no longer trying to impress a version of themselves that no longer needs impressing. You put away the needs work pile without sorting it. You untie the still good bundle and read none of them. You open the what was I thinking scrolls, and instead of hiding them, place one on your windowsill, letting it catch the breeze. Letting it be. Tomorrow you'll write again. Maybe something better, maybe worse, maybe nothing at all. But tonight you've remembered the simplest truth. Not every poem must justify its existence. Sometimes it only needs to mark the fact that you were here. You're not a painter. You've said this many times, firmly, politely, even with a self-deprecating chuckle that scholars use to ward off the suggestion that they dabble in anything requiring color. You write. That's your craft. Ink brush paper discipline over flair. And yet, tonight, for reasons even you can't quite explain, you find yourself grinding pigment. Not ink. Pigment. A small stone dish of crushed ochre, the faint scent of pine soot, and something herbal rising from the mortar. It was given to you weeks ago by an eccentric visiting calligrapher who insisted you try adding a wash to your next scroll. "Let the words swim," he said, eyes twinkling like a man who definitely painted over his fair share of questionable verses. You smiled, accepted the gift, tucked it away, and forgot about it until tonight. You don't know what brought you to it. Maybe it was the dullness of the last scroll you wrote. Maybe it was the cicada's absence tonight, finally quiet. Or maybe you're just curious what your words might look like with a touch of sky behind them. So you begin, tentatively. You unroll a blank scroll tape down the corners with smooth stones, and take up a brush you haven't used in years. It's softer than your usual, made for shading, not clarity. You dip it into the wash and begin dragging pale color across the top of the page. Blue-gray, gentle, not a painting, not really, just atmosphere, mist, mood, the kind of background the moon might approve of. You wait for it to dry. You watch the pigment soak into the paper's fibers. It puckers slightly, warps just a little, and for a moment you panic. This was a bad idea. This is not your art. Then the light catches it just right, and suddenly the scroll breathes. You begin writing. The ink glides over the wash like wind across water. The characters blur ever so slightly at the edges, taking on the softness of thought instead of the crispness of command. You write slower, not from caution, but respect. This page is no longer a blank canvas, it's a collaborator. Historians still argue whether scholars truly embraced mixed mediums in their poetic practice, or whether painting remained the domain of a different, more indulgent caste. Some suggest that subtle washes beneath text were a way to signal emotional depth, while others believe it was an attempt to hide weak verses behind beautiful distraction. Either way, a few surviving scrolls show evidence of pigment faint blue mists, a corner of mountain, the shadow of a pine. Maybe it wasn't decoration. Maybe it was permission. Your brush slows. The poem you've written is short, only 5 lines. It doesn't need more. It reads, "Beneath fog, a single word waits. It has forgotten its name. The sky does not ask for meaning, only color, only the soft suggestion of what might have been said." You exhale. You've surprised yourself. You lay the brush across the inkwell and simply stare. The scroll glows in the lamplight, not with brilliance, but with presence. You didn't write better tonight, you wrote differently. And that difference has opened something. A window you didn't know was closed. A door you'd ignored in favor of familiarity. Later, as you place the scroll aside to dry, you notice your fingers are stained not with ink, but with color. Ochre clings to your knuckles, a smear beneath your thumb. You don't wash it off. You press your hand to the corner of another scroll and leave a mark, not a signature, just evidence. Proof that tonight you tried something new, and it didn't need to be perfect. It only needed to be real. Tonight, the wind is making decisions on your behalf. It rattles the shutters, blows out the first candle before you've even settled into your seat, and sends half of your carefully organized scrolls tumbling across the floor in a miniature paper rebellion. You sigh deeply, like a man who's read too many treatises on patience, and kneel to collect them one by one, tracing your fingers along creases that weren't there before. These were sorted, ordered. Now they're not. The wind doesn't care about your system. Once everything's back in place, or close enough, you relight the candle, shield it with a chipped porcelain bowl, and resume your work. Except, of course, your train of thought has fled. Whatever idea you had before the scroll scattered now exists only as an aftertaste. You try to coax it back. You even write the phrase, as I was saying, in the top corner of your scroll, hoping it will prompt a return. It does not. Instead, you begin to write about the wind. Not poetically, not at first, just facts, observations. It enters without knocking. It leaves without apology. You pause. That's better than it should be. You keep going. It does not care who is reading. It edits without ink. You look up. The shutter creaks again. You wonder if you should just give in and leave the window open, let the whole room be rewritten. You remember a tale about a poet who once let a storm carry his scrolls into the river, insisting later that the best lines always know when to leave. You thought it pretentious when you first heard it. Now it sounds like something you might say next week. You write another line, august as a stanza without structure. Historians still argue whether wind held symbolic meaning for Ming-era poets beyond the obvious metaphors. Some believed it represented divine interruption, an external force reminding scholars that no matter how carefully they constructed their verse, nature always had editorial privileges. Others saw it as a necessary sparring partner, forcing writers to adapt, erase, rewrite. Many scrolls show evidence of smudged, ink-warped edges, verses abruptly cut off mid-line, what some call accidents, and others call collaboration. You shift your brush to your non-dominant hand, a trick you sometimes use to break habit. The strokes are slower, awkward, but raw, honest. You write not to impress, not even to finish, just to stay with the feeling a little longer. Your candle flickers again. The flame leans sharply to the left, casting shadows that seem to whisper across the scroll. You trace them, not with ink, with your eyes, letting them suggest shapes your brush might chase later. Then you stop, because suddenly it's enough. You blow out the candle before it can decide to do it on its own. You sit in the darkness, the scroll before you still drawing its final line, incomplete. Let the wind write what I cannot. You whisper it aloud. It sounds like something the wind might keep. You find the poem not in the scroll, but in the silence. After a question, no one answers. It happens during an afternoon discussion that wasn't meant to be profound. 4 scholars gathered beneath the wisteria arbor, arguing politely about line breaks and the appropriate number of metaphors per stanza, a debate as old as ink itself. Someone Master Shen probably asks, but what is a poem if it doesn't change the person who writes it? And no one replies. Not because they don't have opinions they always do, but because the question doesn't want an answer. It wants space. And in that space, a hush forms. Not awkward, not empty. A hush that carries weight. You sit with it longer than the others do, long after they've drifted back into safer topics, syntax, Tang Dynasty. Comparison, someone's niece who's taken up calligraphy and insists on using gold ink, you remain with the silence like a cat curled in your lap long after the visitor has left. That night, you don't light a lamp. You sit in the dark, at your desk, the paper bare beneath your hand, and think, what has changed in me since I began all this? Not in style, not in form, in substance. You've written about moonlight and ink teacups and silence. But what have you learned? Your brush hovers, no ink touches the page. You start with the title, Letter to My First Poem. The words come slowly, not because they're difficult, because they matter. I did not know how to wait for you. I chased, trimmed, polished. I carved until nothing was left but surface. And still you came not to be read, but to sit beside me and say, you were enough before the line. You stop. Reread. It doesn't feel like a poem. Not yet. More like an apology you didn't know you needed to make. You add a few more lines, rough and unsure. One about the first time you held a brush and believed it could solve you. One about the night you wept over a poem that wouldn't end. One about the silence after a friend praised a line you hated, and how for once you said thank you instead of correcting them. Historians still argue whether Ming poets wrote to heal or only to preserve. The scrolls they left behind rarely mention their own growth, only the movements of the moon, the rustle of pines, the cold clarity of frost. But between the lines, scholars have found edits, revisions, smudges, evidence that something was shifting line by careful line. One poet wrote 137 versions of a single quatrain over 20 years, never claiming to improve it, only to know it differently each time. You keep writing. The poem turns to questions. Not grand ones, intimate ones. Why did I stop writing about my mother's hands? When did I become afraid of rhyme? When did clarity start feeling dishonest? You end the scroll with a line so plain it startles you, I no longer want to impress the moon. You sit back, not satisfied, but stilled. You let the scroll dry in the breeze, leaking through the slats of the shutters. You don't fold it, don't title it again. You simply lay it flat beside you and rest your fingers on its edge, as if it might slip away in the dark. And for the first time in a long time, you don't feel like a poet writing a poem. You feel like someone learning how to speak again, softly, to yourself. The scrolls are quiet tonight. You haven't written a line in hours. Not because there's nothing to say, but because for the first time in many seasons, you no longer feel the need to say it right away. The words can wait. The paper is patient. Even your brush resting on its ceramic holder like a sleeping bird seems content to be still. So you sit, hands folded, candle flickering, and you listen. The courtyard hums with its usual night chorus wind, nudging bamboo, the faint clack of a shutter that never quite closes, a frog somewhere making a sound that always reminds you of a scholar clearing his throat before offering a dubious opinion. Above it all, the moon, now waning, hangs lower in the sky, less assertive than in its full-face glory, but somehow more honest. It offers no performance, just light, just presence. You think about all the scrolls you've written, all the metaphors chased and tamed, all the moments captured, stretched, rewritten. You think of the poems that made people nod politely, and the ones that made them pause and look away, as though you'd said something too personal to leave hanging in the air. You remember the ink-stained sleeves, the cold cups of tea, the nights you swore you'd never write again. You remember the feathered scholar, the crooked character, the broken cup, the poem that ended mid-line and never asked for closure. And here now with your back against the wall and your heart finally soft enough to stop clenching every thought into verse, you ask yourself the one question you never dared to before. Was this really about the poetry at all? Historians still argue whether Ming scholars were chasing beauty or simply trying to understand themselves in quieter terms, whether they wrote to change the world or just to hold it still for a moment long enough to breathe. You suspect they didn't know either. Not at first, not even at the end. They just wrote, and over time that became the answer. You rise slowly and cross the room barefoot on the cool stone and open the wooden drawer where your oldest scrolls live. You take one out, your first maybe. The ink is faded, the lines awkward. You don't laugh. You read it aloud, quietly, a little reverently. The last character is missing. You remember now you never finished it. You don't finish it tonight either. Instead, you pick up your brush, dip it into the ink. Not to write, but to sign your name. Small, careful strokes, the way you used to when you thought a signature meant something final. Then, with a kind of ease you weren't sure you'd ever feel, again you place the scroll gently back inside the drawer. The rest of the night belongs to silence. The scrolls are quiet, and you at last are too. So now if your eyes have grown heavy, if your breath has settled into something slow and tender, then let this moment hold you. Let the candles glow behind your thoughts begin to flicker low. The poems are no longer waiting. The ink has dried, the brush has rested, and the moon, whether she shows her face or hides behind a soft scrim of cloud, is still watching over you without expectation. You've walked the winding garden paths of a scholar's heart, sat beneath the plum tree, listened to the wind rearrange your scrolls. You've wondered what your words mean when no one is there to read them, and you've dared to write them anyway. That, in the end, was always the quiet magic of it. So wherever you are now, on a cushion, beneath a blanket, curled close to the hush of night, know this: your presence, like each of those unspoken lines, is enough. Not because it tries, not because it finishes, but because it is. Close your eyes if they aren't already. Let the last images fade like ink in water, moonlight on rice paper, a forgotten line murmured one final time. Sleep, scholar. The story will still be here in the morning.